just reading, someone had emailed me that there's a missing persons alert out for Gregg Johnson, age 57, wearing a plaid button-down shirt, 6 foot, 200 pounds. That's me.
Bad shirt. Wrong shirt.
Well, that's, yeah, but usually I'd be wearing that. Direction of travel's unknown. Isn't that the truth?
So Gregg, what we usually do is wait till about 3:33 to start.
Okay.
Let everybody get on. And then I'll say a few words and then we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds great.
You guys have everything laid away at Wasika?
I think we're pretty much done, yeah. Yeah, it was a good year. Just, you know, I usually go in the morning just to see how things are going Monday morning, but beyond that, I just have to rely on the guys telling me what's going on.
Yeah, so that's, you probably, since I've been down there, you probably have a whole new crew, right?
Yeah, same people.
Is it?
Same, yeah. Should I be sharing my screen right now, or?
Yeah, go ahead and share.
Looks good.
All right.
I even recognize that area.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm down here in my quarter finished basement and I was facing the wall, and then I got the email that we're going to be here till June 30th. So I redid everything.
Did you really?
I'm looking out the window now. Life's good.
Wow. At least one good thing came out of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I had to go on a little bit of a quarantine there. We were deer hunting, and my niece was the first weekend. My niece left. She got a phone call from her that she was positive for COVID. So,
Oh, is that right?
but none of us got a symptom, but most of us, most of the times outside. So that helped.
Yeah, the closest it got to me was my son, Ryan. I hadn't seen him in a while, but so I didn't get exposed, but he was, it got him pretty good in the lungs.
Oh, ooh.
I mean, he didn't have to go to the hospital or anything, but it hit him pretty good.
So how long did it hold on for him?
Probably about 10 days.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to the APS seminar series. We had a change in the schedule, and on short notice, Gregg Johnson agreed to present a seminar today. So Gregg, we really appreciate that, to keep the seminar series going. So I asked Gregg to present a seminar, knowing, kind of guessing what he was going to be talking about in terms of some of the long-term research that he's been involved in and has been providing leadership over the last number of years. Gregg Johnson is, Dr. Johnson is located at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca, and I'm guessing he's been there just about 20 years. He's been there about 20 years. He's a graduate of the St. Paul campus, and thinking way back, and when we had an IPM program, then he went off to Missouri and then got his PhD at the University of Nebraska. And he was, at that time, he did some really interesting and research in this new wave of precision agriculture, looking at seed bank dynamics of weedy species, and it was some of the first work that was being done in that area. So he's had a long, interesting career, starting with that background in weed science, and now working on cropping systems and looking at long-term impact of these cropping systems on agriculture resiliency. So, Gregg, I'm looking forward to your presentation today. And in most cases, we're set up to hold the questions to the end, but just for everyone online, if you have a burning question along the way, we can have you flag it, and we can bring up that question in the chat room if you so desire. So with that, Gregg, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to the presentation.
All right, thanks, Don. So sort of pinch hitting here, I thought I'd take a few liberties with the style and the content of the presentation. I thought I'd follow the sort of goal of this APR seminar series. And you know, that goal is, you know, I regularly listen to everyone who's presented this fall, and they've been really interesting. But this idea of basically pitching an idea, and that's what we're doing. And we're trying to use that pitch to spar some discussion and some debate. And so today I just want to sort of talk about this whole area of resiliency and stability, and more or less thinking out loud for a while here. And then I'm going to link it to some of the long-term trials. I'm not going to show any data. I'm not going to do any of that. This is just going to be a purely sort of, you know, thought-provoking, hopefully, a presentation of maybe some things we want to consider moving ahead in agronomy, agroecology, any of the plant sciences. So we'll start with that. And, you know, I think the resiliency issue, why am I concerned about it? You can start at several levels. You can talk about resiliency of food systems. You can talk about resiliency of you know, the finances, the risk end of it. But I'm going to focus most of my comments or discussion on resiliency as it pertains to the agroecosystem. And in particular, the stressor, I guess, that I'm most concerned about right now, at least down here in Waseca, but I think statewide, is this whole idea of climate change. And if we look across the state, I think we've all seen these slides. This is one couple slides here I'm going to use were prepared by Tom Hoverstead. Waseca here, he does a great job of sort of summarizing a lot of these weather data. But this shift that we're seeing towards more rainfall and higher temperature, it's a fairly significant and profound shift that has obviously added stress to the system that we're experiencing today. And we need to somehow be able to deal with that in the future. You know, and it's sort of got a spatial element to the rainfall and temperature, as we can all imagine. But what's interesting to me on this slide is just between these various locations, the difference in slope on some of these curves of temperature and precipitation. between southeast, south central, northwest, southwest Minnesota, how those curves differ. But the point being is the slope of all of those are headed up, positive slopes, which is going to bring about obvious change. More closely, what was interesting though is, so some of these soils across the state can absorb more rainfall or deal with certain disruptions better than others. At Waseek in particular, we're dealing with this very heavy clay loam. And so we can't take maybe as much water as some other areas of the state. And once you know it though, we are amongst the top areas in the state as far as inches per year increase since 1930. And also the highest in the state with regard to the annual precip. So that's a real cause of concern for us down here, and we've definitely seen those changes. The other thing that's important about the rainfall, and then we'll move on, is this idea of the intensity of the rainfall that we've been seeing. Tom put this slide together, which is really interesting. Actually, Charlie Rohr put this together. So if you look at the 1 year, what's the greatest 1 year precipitation? So we would expect 2.48 inches to happen once per year, right? And as we look over time in the 30s, we had a couple. If you go through the 50s, 60s, partially into the 70s, it was pretty normal. We would get one of those a year. As we move into the 2010 and beyond, we can see we're getting upwards of 3-4 rainfall events per year that had over 2.48 inches of rain. So we're seeing these really dramatic heavy rainfalls occurring. And as we know, you get that heavy rainfall, most of it's running off and causing a lot of issues, as well as that sort of duration of saturation is getting longer with this increased rainfall. So you sort of set this picture now where we are having these significant disturbances occurring on a fairly regular basis. And so the question is, now how do we adapt these cropping systems to deal with that particular disturbance amongst others? So what I want to do is just, like I said, this is me talking out loud a little bit here. So if we try and understand what exactly is resiliency, and again, I want to focus it to just agroecosystems, so the plant and its environment. What does resiliency mean? And sort of the standard definition that people use is one by this Holling, who says, well, it's the propensity of the system to retain its organizational structure and productivity following this disturbance. So it's all around this sort of organizational structure and retaining that. The second definition attempts to sort of go into it a little deeper and try and take that very ecology focused definition and move it more into managed agroecosystems. And so we start using words like recovery and response and functionality. And so this ability of the system to recover from a disturbance, and then resistance, which is a term that oftentimes goes with resilience, is the ability of the system or the community to withstand a decline in ecological function. So we'll talk about that in a minute here. Holling, continuing with his focus on resiliency, sort of separated out into what he called this engineering and ecological resilience. And you wonder, back in '96, okay, why didn't he incorporate agronomy into here? Well, most of the resilience discussion up to this point has been focused on engineering, economy, economics, and ecology. But what's interesting here is the engineering resilience. So here they state that stability of a system, and he uses this idea of equilibrium steady state. So we want to sort of have some steady state in mind that we want to maintain the system at, and the resistance to disturbance. And then he introduces this concept of speed of return. So it's not only this magnitude of disturbance, but it's also the speed of return. And it's focused on efficiency. The ecology definition of resilience is a little different. So he says, at least, and we can debate this, that the ecological sense of resilience does not depend on an equilibrium steady state, but he says it's far from a steady state. So we're concerned about systems that have a disturbance, and as a result of that disturbance, enter a different state or a different regime of behavior, or what he calls a stability domain. So it's two sort of different ways of looking at resilience. I would argue that agriculture fits more into that engineering resilience, where we're interested in that sort of steady state and how the magnitude and speed of recovery is the goal of that state. The Rist and others in 14 sort of went a little deeper into this. And this figure is one that I've used quite a bit or referred to quite a bit. It's a little abstract, but I'll see if I can walk you through it to some extent. But here he's defining two things: resilience, which is sort of that classic definition. We want to maintain form and structure. And then he talks about coerced resilience, which is created as the result of those anthropogenic inputs that are sort of supplementing the ecological system itself. So it's very much of a managed ecosystem. So in this first figure A, that's sort of this steady state where the ecological system itself is providing the resources and keeping it in that state. But as we supply more of these anthropogenic inputs, you can see that we're sort of holding the system to a higher level of stability. But if you move to C, for example, the steady state increases. But in order for us to hold it at that point, we have to add more of these external or anthropogenic inputs. And as you work yourself to D, E, and F, you see that system, in order to maintain that steady state, you keep having to add more and more and more. And what happens is that condition essentially gets to a tipping point, if you will, where stress or these disturbance events and can cause chaotic change in the stability state or the steady state of that system. So I sort of find this one a little interesting, and I'd encourage anyone to read this particular paper. It was an Ecosphere. It sort of adds another dimension to what we're talking about as far as agroecosystems. So the last sort of definition, and then I will move on, is this one by Gregg Sanford. And so he's part of the group in Wisconsin who deals with the integrated cropping systems. It's a long-term research site in Wisconsin that is working with a number of managed ecosystems, but using livestock-based, forage-based systems along with corn, soybean, more or less typical annual, along with some perennial crops as well. So it's a pretty diverse set. But Gregg recently gave a seminar to as part of the Soil Health Economics Forum, and he presented this sort of graphical definition of stability and resiliency that I found kind of handy to interpret. And so he starts out by talking about resiliency and stability, looking at productivity. So you have time on the x-axis and output on the y-axis, however you want to define those terms. And then he divides it up into high productivity area and low productivity areas. So if we move down to resilience first, and we talk about that. So he's got this resilience as being sort of that disruption to the system. So the output of productivity or the output within both the high and productive system drops significantly with the occurrence of these stressors. But then once the stressor is removed, the systems rebound. And so in a high productivity situation where there's a lot of anthropogenic inputs, a lot of inputs put in the system, you can see that that drop isn't quite as dramatic as in those low productivity systems. So it's able to absorb some of those stresses better than the low productivity, but he's arguing that over time those do coalesce once the stressor is removed and you go along. So I'm going to take a little liberty here with his presentation and suggest that resilience or stability is a series of just these resilient events. And so it takes a little, maybe a little longer time frame, but if you look at the stability, so it's these series of waves, these series of stresses and responses and magnitude of response that dictates the level of stability. And you can see here again how in a low productivity, those waves are much more, much higher magnitude than in a highly productive system. The other thing that's interesting about Gregg's graphic here is the slope of those lines, the slope of those output lines are always positive. So I asked the question here then, well, what if that was a zero slope line? What if it was a negative slope line? How does that change our interpretation of those bounces back and forth and responses to stressors? And I'm going to get into that in a little bit as well. But I'm going to dive just a little bit deeper. And I'm going to go back to Holling's engineering resistance definition, where he talks about this resistance to disturbance and the speed of return. And I think those are two key components of this definition that we need to sort of dive into a little bit better as we sort of finish up this discussion by talking, well, how do we deal with this? So Ford Dennison came up with this sort of figure to illustrate this point that I found very intriguing, and we've used it in a couple proposals that we've written over the last couple of years. But it has to do with this idea of magnitude and response to stress. So he's illustrating this point of, let's say there is a drought. And if we look at that bottom panel B, and we impose a drought at, day 2. The lower surface or the open circles suggests that when that drought happens, the magnitude isn't as great, but the pace at which it resumes to a normal state is much slower than the shallow soils, and that's what we would expect, right? Those soils on the surface dry out quickly, but then once we get that rain event or that completion of that stress, it bounces back pretty quickly. And so if we look at the effect of that situation on things like plant photosynthesis, we might follow that same graphic. But here, crops with shallow roots, of course, would take a much bigger hit because the drought was more severe at those shallower soil positions, but then quickly returns, whereas deep-rooted crops can take advantage of those deeper soils, and so you get the slower decline, right? So it just sort of illustrates this point fairly well. I want to dive into that a little bit more. I've been saying that throughout, but I am going to finish up here in a minute. But so I sort of created this graph. And I'm going to build on this. So we have two systems, system A, which is the orange line, and system B, which is the blue line. You can call it plant A, system A, I don't care. But we do have a percentage of the output. Again, I don't care what that is, in time, I don't care what you want to assign to that time, whether it be years, days, hours. But the point here is just to mimic Ford's graph by saying that if a stress is imposed here, we might have one system that drops significantly and returns, or we might have one where stress is imposed, it drops, and then it's slow to come back. So I call that magnitude and recovery of response, just basically talking about Holling's definition again. But to me, you have to include both of those components when you talk about agroecosystem resilience. You have to talk about the magnitude of that reduction in productivity or whatever it might be, but you also have to match that with that recovery period. So how long is that recovery period going to take? So I'm going to take a huge leap here, and I know there'll be debate around this, but I would sort of suggest that the genetics and breeding projects that are focused on resilience are concerned or more focused on this aspect of magnitude, and dare I say gets into the realm of adaptation or adoption or adaptability, I should say, of the system. And I'm not going to pretend to know everything in this area. There are some great talks given as part of this series. Candy Hirsch gave one as part of the Dean Seminar series, which is really well done. On looking at those genetic by environment interactions and how we use genetics, I would argue that that's more of an attempt to deal with this magnitude issues through adaptability. I would also argue that agroecology is more focused on this recovery time. So in other words, I think we're trying to look at agroecology as a way to create an environment that allows that plant to, or whatever you want to term, to recover much quicker in that environment compared to maybe a more static environment that we're used to seeing. Now you'll notice both of those lines, they do enter the agroecology. I used an oval line, so agroecology gets into addressing magnitude, genetics, breeding, does get into some of the recovery time, but for the most part, I think these two sort of areas of science tend to focus on one way or the other. And so my argument, though, is this is where we need to be operating in this blue area. In order for us to understand resiliency in the context of understanding the magnitude of response as well as the recovery timing or the recovery period, we have to understand the genetics and its interaction with agroecology of that environment. There's a lot of work going on in that area, but this is, I think, what we really need to strive for in the future. So I invite these different components to think about how the other might help address that central figure. So, all right, so what are we doing along these lines, and how can we maybe make some improvements? So if we go back to, there's a really good book called Agricultural Resilience. I have the reference at the bottom left, Perspectives from Ecology and Economics. It's a really good book. It's available online through the library. If you get a chance, you're interested in the subject, read through there. They do a really nice job of sort of explaining and summarizing this whole area of agricultural resilience. And so Gardner, in her summary contents, in fact, they were the editors of this book, sort of summarized that whole book. And really it comes down to this very simple definition of resilience is the ability of the system to cope with change. And it's very simplest sort of concept. And so if we say, all right, we need to develop systems that can cope with change, and then we consider this argument that resilience is comprised of both the magnitude of the disruption or the output and the recovery time, then we ask ourselves, okay, what can we do to improve the resiliency of agroecosystems that again are predominantly dominated by these anthropogenic inputs? And that gets back to this coerced resilience that I talked about earlier by Russ, who is basically arguing that we're holding things at an artificial state. So how do we use genetics? How do we use agroecology? How do we use different disciplines working together to deal with this issue? So we typically do this. And one example I have here is by focusing in on diversification. And I think we've all talked about that to one extent or the other, the value of diversification and the sort of benefits it can bring, both short and long term to sort of that output of a crop or whatever we're looking at. So we tend to look at diversification from a number of different angles. We look at crop rotation, right? That's the easiest way to maybe define diversification is we're going to diversify over time. We're going to try different crop rotations, and in fact, that's worked wonderfully. I mean, that's well documented, the benefits of crop rotation. We're starting now through Forever Green to integrate cover crops, oilseed crops. There's a whole litany of crops that we're trying to add on to the landscape to not only provide that temporal diversification, but also spatial diversification, and looking at the role in those cover crops as actually in an attempt to change that soil environment to make it more resilient by changing cropping system properties, microbial properties, whatever it might be. We look at diversifying tillage. I know we've all talked about the benefits of reduced tillage as far as improving soil structure, microbial populations, those sorts of things. And then we start to move into this sort of strategic crop placement issue, which is of interest to me. How do we place those crops on the landscape using the environment, the resources that we have available to us to match that in a way that allows improved resiliency and stability in the system. And of course, then we've got to understand how genetics play into all of those things I've previously listed. And so with the genetics, if I can back up just a minute, the genetics piece too, it's, for example, so we breed for, I'll just take a very simple example of we might breed for drought resistance, which would help us with that, the magnitude. We hope to reduce the magnitude at which we get a disruption in the output through yield. But it's understanding how things like cover crops, oilseed crops, how they can maybe mitigate in conjunction with a drought tolerant hybrid to maybe reduce that, but also reduce the speed or increase the speed of recovery. So that's what I'm talking about, is understanding those interconnections and how they play together. So for us to address this issue, I think the most critical thing that we need to do better is to understand these, what I'm calling dynamic interaction that occurs spatially and temporally between plants, animals, and their environment. So all these feedback mechanisms. just because we do something doesn't mean that's good from a resiliency standpoint or a sustainability standpoint. We need to understand the subtle feedbacks that are occurring, and how we might be able to manipulate, if you will, some of those interactions to help reduce the magnitude of the outcome of that disturbance, as well as time of recovery. We also have to realize multiple value outcomes and functions. So here again, it's maybe not just about yield, maybe it's about something else. And it's oftentimes things that we don't think about. So it's, if we think about yield, but also, things like ecosystem services, things like oil and other secondary outcomes of that corn kernel, if you will, and what influences those have. So we need to really think about what is that outcome and what is the function that we're trying to value in these systems before we can address resiliency. Scale is critically important. How is this scalable? To what scale can we implement this at? All very important parts. We also have to define the resilience boundary. So I always put this resilience of what to what. What are we trying to measure here? Are we looking at photosynthesis? What are we looking at? What do we want the system to be resilient to? We also have to make sure that we put resilience in context of these higher interactions. I talked about that at the beginning: food security, finances, everything, risk, and what are the playoffs that happen when we start taking what we find as far as developing a resilient and stable cropping system. How does that then play with some of these higher scale issues like food security, and what are the trade-offs involved with that? And then this risk strategy or hedge betting is really kind of interesting if you think about it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But so I reproduced this graph down here again, just to sort of remind you of what we're dealing with. So there's a lot of things that we need to think about when we deal with this resiliency stability issue. But I think it's doable as long as I think we make sure we explore both the magnitude and the speed of recovery of these systems when implementing certain practices. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about this hedge betting because it's sort of interesting. So it's all about these trade-offs, right? And so this blue line, this is just, we can change however we want to look at this, but this blue line is sort of representing this conservative bet hedger. So if you look at the x-axis, this is sort of saying what's the chance of getting that perfect environment, that environment where we can really produce a good corn crop or good soybean crop. And then the y-axis, let's consider that now productivity of a crop, yield or starch content or whatever you want to view it. So if we take a conservative bet hedger, that's saying that I want a system that is not as productive, if one being the relative fitness or high productivity level, it's not going to be as productive, but I spread that risk out over time, so I'm fine, right? If you take a diversified hedge better, he's saying, all right, overall, across all of these environments, I'm going to sort of split the balance, but I'm going to maybe conserve a little bit on that decision of what system I want to implement. If you move to this specialist, so that's an area where they're more concerned in one way or the other, right? So it's saying a good year specialist would say, look, I want to realize the highest possible productivity that I can. And if that means I've got to deal with some poor years or low productivity, then that's what I have to do. Versus a bad year specialist, which is saying, all right, I'm going to hedge against bad years. I want to create a system where I do really well in those bad years because I figure they're going to happen more often than good years. So this, maybe I didn't explain that quite right, but it's this idea of trade-offs. It's getting away from this idea of just because we create a resilient system doesn't mean it's going to fit in all situations. That we have these various risk averse or risk situations that we need to be aware of, and we need to create systems that fit these different sort of situations. So I just bring that up for consideration as we're talking about this. So the next thing I just want to briefly get into is, okay, so we've talked about this. This could take hours to debate, but I've given you a really quick overview of resilience. Okay, so how do we work together? How do we take all these disciplines and how do we work, or what's the right way to work on this? And I'm going to do a shameless plug for our long-term platform that we have in the state, which we're calling the Minnesota Long-Term Ag Research Network. To me, this is a perfect place for us to deal with these resiliency issues. It's a place where we can bring many different disciplines together under one platform to, again, explore these different areas of resiliency and stability. And so we've got this site scattered across 3 different areas of the state that represent these different precipitation climates or regimes. We've got different temperature regimes set up. And we're hoping to get another one up northwest, but we've got 3 sites right now. For a long-term research site, this is very, very unique. Most of the ones I've got off to the left, some classic examples of long-term research sites are usually conducted at one site. So by doing a 3-site, we can really start to get at this issue of scale, at climate, of environment, to find out how resiliency changes across these different ecoclimates, if you will. And so what we did in each one of these is we just set up a series of cropping systems, and we've been having that in place since 2015. So it's not terribly old, but we're getting there. We've got each crop in the rotation represented every year. So it's got a fairly big imprint. Or what I'm trying to get at is this is really, really unique about our design. This is the whole experimental site. So again, it's representing those cropping systems in each phase every year. What we've done is within that block, so let's say this is the corn phase of a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, or it might be the polyculture perennial system. We've got a series of subplots set up alongside. So this main area is where we're taking data consistently throughout the entire duration of this long-term platform. So nothing will be done in that main plot. What we're able to do in these subplots is start implementing those different strategies that we might think might add to resiliency. So for example, we might put a series of cover cropping treatments in each one of these subplots. And we might look at not only how that cover crop is influencing corn yield, for example, but we can begin looking at the effect of that corn on the cover crop, as well as the effect of the cover crop on the corn. But we can also maybe look at changes in microbial communities as a function of that crop, or that cover crop being in the system. We can look at soil properties over time. How does soil structure change? How does nutrient cycling change? What are the feedbacks involved in those sorts of changes? And then ultimately, how does it affect resiliency and stability over time? Now, because we're collecting the same data at the same time in the same way between all three of these sites, we're now able to look at scale and saying, all right, how do those relationships change over time and space as a function of its environment? It's a very unique way of thinking about it. And it's open to anybody, but it's a great little platform to begin doing this type of work. Here's an overview of each site. Like I said, a fairly large footprint, but a way to sort of get this work done in a somewhat efficient way over time. The other thing I just want to mention quickly is we are also, or we did add another component to this. So we sort of handpicked a few treatments out of the main LTARN design, and we put those on 3 landscape positions: a summit, a depositional, and a hill slope position. And we're again trying to get at this question, okay, how do those interconnections, those interrelationships, how does resilience and stability affected by changes in landscape position? And if you think about hill slope, and we always talk about this, back in the day, I used this design to look at weeds and to say, all right, we have a depositional position that's draining 2 hill slopes. And we see the duration of soil saturation is much longer in those areas. We saw a completely different weed spectrum. We saw different growth rates. We saw a completely different way of managing weeds in those depositional areas compared to summit and hill slope. So it gets its site-specific sort of management, but we can extend that now and say, all right, how does a depressional environment, if we integrate covers or oil seeds, or we rotate it with some other crop, hazelnut, for example, how does that then affect the resiliency of that corn crop in that depositional compared to a summit? So it gets at this question of scale, and again, being able to look at this over space and time is really a unique way of doing it. So I pretty much used up my time. So again, I wanted to make this more of a conversation, not so much of a present results. And I would really love to hear your thoughts on this. I am by no means an expert in this. I just throw those out there to spur some discussion. So are there any thoughts or any comments as far as this resiliency issue? Something I didn't think about.
So it's wide open for comment, questions, discussion.
What do the genetics folk think about this as far as their role in maybe suppressing the magnitude of, is that a correct way of presenting it? Or can you argue that that actually you're using that platform to look at speed of recovery?
So Jake raised his hand, Cody.
Jake, go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to respond to the genetics piece, but
Okay.
Greg, thanks a lot for the presentation. You know, I find this topic really interesting as well. I have a question about the slide that you have with the 3 figures showing yield, stability, and resiliency, can you swing back to that? And I want to ask you the question in this slide right here. Yeah. So the stability figure shows there's more variability in the lower yielding system. And I want to ask you if you think that's a generalizable trend or not, because in what I've seen in the plant ecology literature, and you've seen this too, I'm sure, looking at polyculture yield and variability, sometimes we see equal or higher yield in the high diversity systems, but not always, especially when we're comparing to monocultures like switchgrass that have been, bred for just for high yielding. And but when we see that, like a really high yielding, outperforming switchgrass cultivar versus a more diverse polyculture, we often actually see less variability in the more diverse system. So there, I don't know if this correlation is consistent, but the low yielding system might be more stable in terms of its standard deviation of yield through time. That's, something. Yeah. What's your response to that?
No, you're right on, Jake. This cannot be, generalized by any means. And, it gets to that, this idea of matching the crop with its environment. And if you're in those low productivity environments, that curve is going to look far different if you implement a system that goes back to those, as I described earlier, those basins of attraction, those systems that take advantage of the synergies that are incurred as a result of increased plant diversity. So you're right, in those systems where you have that, complementary plants together in a polyculture. You have the legumes, you have the forbs, you have the grasses. They're all playing together to actually improve the efficiency of that resource base. And in that case, I think those oscillations are dampened, considerably. I think what Gregg was getting to here was more of that corn soybean. If you're planting corn in the headlands or down in an unproductive, eroded area where that resource base is not propped up or and oftentimes can't be propped up, even with all these inputs, the result of a stress, be it drought, be it insects, whatever it might be, is going to be much greater than in a highly productive area. So I think that's what he was sort of getting at here. But you're spot on, Jake.
Cool.
All right, looks like Axel had a question or comment. Go ahead, Axel.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. So very interesting approach, Gregg. Thank you very much for bringing this to our seminar series. I found it especially interesting, this definition of resilience and its relation with stability. And I was wondering, we tend to criticize a lot, and I am one of them actually, our monoculture or monocrops or industrial agriculture. And we think that, and we should diversify those systems so we do better. So I wonder, however, if diversifying at least for our conditions here in Minnesota is going to be good enough for sustainable cropping. So based in this discussion today, do you think that will be possible, or we should be looking much more into a let's say, an equilibrium between what is agro-industrial production and much more agroecological one. I mean, a middle term, I mean.
Yeah, yeah. So you're right. The current. So if you said, yeah, I need to diversify, I'm going to put in a corn, soybean, wheat, or corn, alfalfa, whatever it might be, and that should help. Thank you very much. Goodbye. That's not what I'm advocating at all. You don't diversify for diversification's sake. It's this idea of having the information, the research, the knowledge base to go back to say, all right, on this, in this particular environment, this soil, this climate, that based on what we know from a research standpoint, we know that I need to diversify in a more deliberate way. I need to do some things that would introduce a combination of spatial and temporal diversification. I need to go with that corn, soybean, wheat, but in that soybean wheat year, I might want to go into oilseed crops or some other intercropping strategy, because based on the research, we've seen that that intercropping, that oilseed crop, just from that fallow period that we've talked a lot about, just having roots in the soil at that point is helping soil structure. It's helping microbial. That coupled with a more of a temporal diversification has really dampened those oscillations. So when I do get the stress is less. It's sort of a deliberate way of designing cropping systems. And so this is the beauty of Forever Green and other initiatives, is that we are able to start going down this road because we have this portfolio of crops available for us to begin integrating and understanding the effect of that crop in this big picture way, and in not only measuring what is the presence of a crop, an intercrop, or the presence of intermediate wheatgrass, or the presence of hazelnut in the system. Not only what is it doing economically, or from an economically diverse standpoint, but how is that affecting the feed banks, seed banks, the long-term stability and resiliency of the entire system. That's where we are sort of blessed in this department, is to have that portfolio available to begin asking these longer term questions. But it's got to be done in a deliberate way. It just can't be done ad hoc. I'll do this, and this, and we'll see what happens. So that's sort of why I'm arguing for this sort of long-term LTAR sort of approach, where we can really sort of explore those interconnections and those relationships to eventually get to a point where these decisions are not made willy-nilly, that they're made in a very deliberate way, based on what we think the stressors are going to be, and based on what the based on the environment that we're in.
Looks like Seth has a question. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, real quick, Greg, excellent job. I'm going to maybe follow up just a little bit, but you led me down this path thinking about these individual stressors and years, and I kept thinking that this time sequence was within a year, and so that's what I had imprinted in my brain.
Oh, yeah.
And so how do you see this, and maybe that was completely outside of what you're thinking about, but I could see this longer term stress, stability, resilience question. If you look at these time sequences over many years, that the questions are a little different and the responses to those are a little bit different. Can you comment, or do you see that same type of thing, or do you think it's all the same? Do you think these strategies would be quite similar, speaking on those different sequences, the time sequence?
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm going to answer your question here, Seth, but you know what Gregg is sort of depicting there is these sort of regular oscillations. And even if we did implement a strategy to dampen those or reduce the effect of a given stress, the magnitude of stress, you're not going to see this regular pattern of oscillations. I really think that those oscillations are going to change over time. And the system, which brings up, another component is this idea of being nimble. It's this idea of being able to change the combination of cropping systems or the combination of interrelated plants in a way that is adapting to this changing climate or changing stress pattern. So those oscillations are going to be, completely different. Now, with respect to the time question on the resilience, so that on the resilience panel on time, I think that time frame is in the order of days. And if we look at Ford's idea of we're going to measure photosynthetic response, if there was a stress of some type, a drought, an insect, whatever it might be, the recovery and the magnitude of which that output is reduced and the recovery time is going to be fairly short. And so, as I said, if you take those fairly short events and put them all together in a time series over months or over years, you get to the stability. The response to that stressor might be different all the time. The response to that stressor might be different. So it's going to be this very irregular pattern that we're seeing in as far as stability, because the pattern's going to be different on resilience. Did that somewhat get close?
Yeah, I think it's good. It's just the question of what part of this you see, and I think it's part of your perspective. And I guess that's part of my question is what do you envision as a stressor, and is that an individual point in stress in terms of days, or are we talking about these year-long, very long-term cycles? And it affects how you look at this whole animal, as whether what you see as that duration of that stress.
Right.
To me, it becomes a different question.
Yep. Excellent point. Yep. Spot on.
Okay, looks like we have a question here from Jess Skutnik. Go ahead, Jess. I just allowed you to talk.
All right, and I know it's at 4:30, so Gregg, I'm happy to talk to you about this offline as well.
Okay.
No, we go on for another half hour.
Oh, you do? Well, I might not be able to. So
We'll make it fast, Jessica.
yeah, I'm gonna ask my question. So, now that these things, even the current systems that may not be as resilient or as we would dream of, have been in the ground for a few years, are you starting to see some indication of how the soil is changing under these different cropping systems or across the different LTAR sites, and kind of how that might be mediating, changes that you're already seeing with, year-to-year variation in the weather patterns? I was kind of curious if you're starting to see some of these mediation effects of the soil playing out.
Yeah. So we are finally at the point here where we can begin asking those questions. So we're beginning this winter, we're going to begin in earnest some of the analysis of this data, because, you have to go through at least 2 cycles. We need to represent, we've gone through multiple 2-year cycles. We've gone through 2 3-year cycles, and we're starting it on 4-year cycles. So we're getting the data set to answer the question that you're asking. Now, what we've done is we took a bunch of called time zero data. So we took a number of soil structure, soil, all these different soil parameters before the experiment was started. I know we went out this summer and we took some measurements on soil structure, and right now I'm getting into soil science, which I don't want to be. The soil structure and what word am I looking for? The speed at which water goes through. I just lost the term.
Infiltration? The infiltration rate. Maybe.
Yeah, infiltration rate. Those sorts of parameters we measured this summer. So those will be available to us this winter. And so we're gonna try and match that up with what we're seeing as far as the stability and resiliency of those different systems over time and space. So I wish I could answer your question, but we just haven't been in the ground long enough.
Yeah, it's exciting that it's getting to that point, though, for sure.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So
awesome. Well, I'm curious to hear how it shapes up.
Yep.
Thanks.
Let you know.
I believe there's a question from Ford Dennison. Ford, I think your microphone's opened up. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm just following up on Seth's question. I agree that I think the time scale is potentially really interesting when you're talking about resilience. If you have an annual crop, it had better recover fast enough that you get some yield. So, I agree with Gregg. We're really talking about, not too many days probably to get some kind of recovery. On the other hand, if it's something like alfalfa, then if it gets defoliated this year or suffers from drought this year, you're not necessarily going to rip it out. You're maybe still hoping for some yield next year. And if it's an apple orchard, even if it gets defoliated to the point where you don't get any apples this year, you're not going to go in and tear those apples out. So, I think in the L-tarn, we don't have any apples, but we do at least have the potential to look at different timescales for resilience in comparing the annual crops with the alfalfa or with the Gregg, what's the plots that have like more or less like native prairie?
Oh, the polyculture.
Yeah. So because I think a lot of this resilience stuff from the ecology literature, they're really talking about you have a bad year, what are things like next year? But with annual crops, we do need to think about a much shorter time scale than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The somewhat related, but the timing of that stress is also very important. What phenological stage are we at when that stress occurs is going to have a big impact on magnitude and recovery as well.
All right. Looks like Axel has another question. Axel, I think I opened your mic. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. It has been covered already, much better than I was about to ask for. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. There was a few in the chat, Gregg. Les Everett asked, what soil parameters are measuring with regard to resilience?
Soil what?
Soil parameters are you measuring with regard to resilience?
So that brings up another interesting sideline conversation. So just the direct answer to your question is, we are collecting, a number of soil parameters. I mentioned one when Jess asked her question about, porosity, structure, those sorts of things. But we are, measuring, fertility, of course, and, basic soil parameters. We would love to do a much more in-depth analysis, but you know, it's not like we have a you know, unlimited budget here. So what we've started to do now is, so we archived, we archived a lot of soil samples at time zero. So we have those as a starting point. And so if someone came in and was funded to really start looking at, in a very detailed way, how that soil structure has changed over time, we certainly have the starting soil samples that we can go back to and do that same sort of analysis and get an understanding of the trajectory of change in soil given a particular cropping system. Now, having said that, though, I know there's been some research that's been conducted in the L-Tarn already, where they have sort of looked at a little more in depth at some of these soil things, but it's only occurred maybe over a 3-year period, which is, you know, a funding period. And that's, you know, I'm sort of rambling now, but that's the other thing on this platform that we have to be really careful. When we talk about productivity, stability, and resilience, nobody's going to get out and successfully get 30 years of funding. Except you, Don, you might be able to pull it off, but most of us are on 2 to 3 year funding cycles. So we have to do experiments that, or we have to be very careful to do experiments where we can get a short-term outcome, you know, a paper, results, something, but still maintaining the continuity of that data collection over time. So it's trying to find these teams that will sort of jump frog over another to remain, you know, a continuous data set over time. And that's really what we're striving for, you know, with this particular funding model.
Greg, that's one thing, just to follow up on budgets, you know, going back when we initiated the conversations about initiating this program, one thing that people really worried about, right, was the long stability of support for this concept. And those of us that have been around for a long time know what happened with our long-term studies at Lamberton, right?
Yep.
We just weren't able to support them. What is the conversation at the national level, NSF, USDA, in terms of support for these types of research sites and the support for the research that could be carried out at these sites?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Well, you know, the USDA is supporting this type of research through their own sort of internal long-term research networks that are scattered throughout the country. And that's great. There is support for that work. There's some issues I have with that design, but there's a lot of interest and there is support being put towards those sites. From a sort of individual site, so let's say, you know, our site here in Minnesota, you know, you've got sites in Wisconsin with the WISP trial, you've got Iowa, several. The way we're dealing right now is to combine forces. So we've had some pre-COVID sort of last year forums where we've gotten together and we've talked about funding and how we can sort of combine our resources or our sites to go after some national funding in a very sort of collaborative way. We've done that to some extent. We haven't been successful, but we're trying to hit now because we feel like the fire is hot as far as support these long-term trials. But, you know, they're just so expensive. and we were hoping for some college support to sustain this sort of long-term platform. But as we all know, the budget levels aren't conducive to supporting some of these initiatives. So we've lost some of the funding there to at least, give us a base level of support. But right now it's just trying to work with other long-term sites and go after it en masse.
Right. I think it's the right time, if in fact Biden becomes the president with a focus on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
There's a core of us working with GEMS, the Protein Center, and for Evergreen,
Mm-hmm.
which encompasses, and I include, what you're thinking about as part of that overall package. I think the time might be right to take this multi-state approach, the group in Wisconsin, Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
actually taking that forward as a major new federal program focused on food and climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
It might be the time to put that model out there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
people always say, well, we're in this real turmoil, but remember when the land grant system was created, right in the middle of the Civil War.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I'm saying this might very well be that time to take on that grand challenge, but tying it to stability of food production and climate. This
Right.
may very well be the time, since we've made that investment in some of these areas. Maybe it's time to pull these in context and collaboration with our neighboring states. Don't go alone with Minnesota, but develop as a network. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we want to talk a
Yeah.
little more about that.
Yeah. No,
I
I
think-
agree.
I think Axel, you can unmute your microphone. I believe now. I had a comment or question to add to this. Maybe not. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, I was just, I just wanted to quickly give a comment. Yeah, Don is right. I mean, well, first, the NSF has been very supportive to long-term research, actually. And I know by fact that they have supported more than one effort in that way. And what Don said is exactly what they have done. They are supporting research in long-term sites to look at, the effects of, agricultural intensity on the environment. That's basically more or less what they have been doing. And I also am hoping that with our new government, probably we will have a chance to get something done with the LTARN.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've found over time is we're probably late. The point is, if we're going to do it, you got to do it now while the debate over what's going to happen is going on. And that debate is going on right now. So what I'm saying back to you guys is there's a series of concepts there. Some of them are being brought together, but they need to be brought together pretty fast. And I mean 10 damn days, right?
Yeah.
Right. In terms of getting it into the conversation, because there's going to be a lot of debate and it's going to happen really fast in terms of where the new investments in climate change is going to occur. And by the middle of January, February, things will be down the road already.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, hopefully with our prior discussions on a regional basis, that I would hope we can coalesce as a group fairly fast and move on something. And I'm gonna have a conversation with Liebman and that group and Randy Jackson in Wisconsin and see if we can pull something together. But I think it's important too, like you said, Don, to tie that to food security and other kind of broader issues.
Yeah, in the impact of climate change on food security, I think that rather than just talking about cropping systems, talk about it in a way that connects to the big discussions that are occurring.
Right.
And at the national level, it's not cropping systems, right?
No. Uh,
You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
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 Well, Gregg, thank you very much for your stimulating conversation you brought to us today. And we
Well,
appreciate it.
if anybody has any other comments, or please feel free to, I'd love to talk about this some more.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Greg. Great job.
All
Thank
right.
you, Greg. That was good.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
All right. See ya.
So, thanks for attending, everyone. Stay well, and we'll see you next Monday. Greg, have you seen the document that's just being put together on a focus on environment or climate stability, climate stability, but resilience of food systems tied to plant proteins for
Not the
evergreen,
one. No,
for
I haven't.
evergreen, gems, and,
Oh,
and the protein center. I'm going to send
Yeah.
it to you. I'm going to send
dude,
it. To
I haven't read it. I know what you're, yeah, but I haven't read it. No.
you. Yeah, let me send that to you. I think that is a platform model
Yeah.
to think through, right?
Yeah.
But this
Well-
would add, and you can't go after any federal money, new big money, if it isn't multi-state, right?
Right.
So I think if you got the senators from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and a few other states to present the case, I think this would be a very
Yeah, I agree.
viable time to do it.
You know, and I've long advocated for this. Let's not tie it to yield.
No,
It's-
it has to be tied. It has to be tied to food.
Yep. 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 Has to be. So,
So I'll send the current draft of that to you.
okay, that'd be great.
Take a look at it.
Okay.
Because I mean, we were thinking of taking it to the foundations, but
Mhm.
also at the federal level, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Right.
still in probably the third draft, so it's still
Okay.
open.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I didn't think, and I apologize, I didn't think about the long-term system.
Oh,
I
yeah.
was thinking more. I was thinking of GEMS because of their landscape design, right, and that big data management approach.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yeah.
now that we probably take a look at it and see
Yep.
whether LTRs fit into that
Okay.
in
I'll do that.
partnership with GEMS. Do you guys work with GEMS?
Yes. So, but on a, so we've talked to them about LTAR. What they're doing now is they're testing some sort of sensors on our LTAR plots to get this question of what's the value of this micro environmental data?
Yeah.
And we can measure that response over time and space. But they're not doing it from an agronomic value. So, but yeah,
Well,
we do have a
but that's the intent of this document that we're putting together. So
Okay. That'd be,
let me
yeah, I'd
send
love
it
to
to
read
you.
that.
Let
Okay.
me send it to you, and then maybe we ought to talk tomorrow.
Okay, sounds great.
All right. Thank you very much.
All
Appreciate
right,
it.
thank
Good
you.
job.
Bye.
Bye.